Hello, hello. Welcome back to Peak Human. I'm Brian Sanders. Please check out the Food Lies intro on the Food Lies YouTube channel. It is going strong. It is going somewhat viral. We need to push it out there a little more. Please comment. Please share with people. This is the first step in getting the Food Lies docuseries out there. We need to attract all the right people, get interest from Netflix, get interest from more distribution companies, and it'll help us maybe get some more funding and connect with the right people to get it out there. You can support it at foodlies.org. We're still needing contributions to the Indiegogo. So thanks so much for that. And thanks so much for going back to episode 1, listening to all the old episodes of this podcast. So many good ones, so many guests with great info. Today, my guest is Jay Feldman, who I started talking to about 9 months ago. Really interesting guy, has some different ideas about health. Although maybe 90% of them are the same as the ancestral health principles, the same stuff about animal foods are great, saturated fats are great, PUFAs are bad, the polyunsaturated fats, the seed oils are bad, the refined grains are bad, the processed foods are bad. Really a lot of the same stuff, but he has some different ideas about using carbs as a fuel source, whole food, good carbs, fruit, tubers, honey, etc. So check this one out. I'm doing some more content on this style of eating. It's called pro-metabolic or bioenergetic way of eating. I've been messing around with it for a couple of years now. I think it's really interesting and can be beneficial to a lot of people. So a little bit more about Jay. Jay Feldman is a health coach, independent health researcher, and host of the Energy Balance podcast. He has degrees in neuroscience and exercise physiology and is devoted to using his knowledge and experience to help people heal from all manner of disease, dysfunction, and difficulty losing excess body fat. To work with Jay, you can find him at jayfeldmanwellness.com. This was such a great discussion. We went to a lot of details. It went long, which I know you guys love. We get into all the interesting nuances of how the body works, satiety. We get into nutrients, we get into protein, we get into fat loss, we get into so many things. So I hope this can shake up people's ideas and maybe they're already on the same page because it's all kind of in the same realm of ancestral health and what human bodies need to thrive. So before we begin, got to talk about Nose to Tail. This is my company that supports the show, supports the local ranchers here in Texas, supports regenerative agriculture, and supports you with healthy meat and healthy other products, whole food products like our biltong. This is the South African version of beef jerky. Drovores as well is the stick version. And livervores, it has the liver mixed in with the grass-fed ground beef, 30% liver, great way to get it in your diet. You can get the biltong and the drovores at nosetotail.org. We also have our meat boxes. We're on a bit of a hold because it's so hot and it's hard to ship meat in this weather. So we're only shipping out to cities nearby. We're not going to the coast for a week, I think. We'll be back soon. Check that out. We also got the body care. We got the soap. We got the lip balm. All kinds of great stuff. Still working through all kinds of issues. Being a boutique company, we're small. It's hot out there. It's hard to get the skin food shipped because it gets super hot and it has broken open for some people in the mail. So we're really trying to not lose any more product. And so we put a hold on that, but it'll be back soon. And our deodorant will be out soon. So excited about that one. Beef tallow, clean deodorant, no chemicals. You can also go to sapien.org. Learn about our health program with Dr. Gary, the Sapien Tribe. You can go there, join us, get the extended show notes. We're going to start doing the Zoom calls again. Also, speaking of Sapien, the Sapien compound or the Sapien Center is opening soon in Austin. Get ready for that. We're going to get meat out locally to people straight from the ranches around town, have events, have all kinds of stuff. Sign up for the Sapien newsletter. You'll learn about everything about the film when it's coming out, all the updates at sapien.org. Join the newsletter there. Send out a quick newsletter each week. And that's about it. Go to nosetotail.org. Get your meats, get your seasonings, even hats. Get your hats. Got the steak hats, 2 steak hats, and a Nose to Tail hat. Thanks so much for supporting me by getting great products at Nose to Tail, by sharing this podcast, by giving a review on iTunes, and going to sapien.org, checking us out there. Thanks so much, and enjoy this show with Jay Feldman. Hello, hello. Welcome back to Peak Human Podcast, everyone. We're here with Jay Feldman, calling in from Mexico. How's it going, man?
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, doing pretty well over here.
Great. Yeah. Last time we talked was probably 9 months ago. I think you're in Costa Rica. You're kind of bouncing around doing remote life, which is great. And we talked about the bioenergetic way of living and diet. Some people may know it as pro-metabolic. I've done some episodes with Kate Deering. We did a little debate with Dr. Jamie Seaman, and I'm going to have Kate Deering back on to do a solo episode so she can talk more about this stuff. And Tomo Littlewood, so Keith Littlewood is a bit in this world. Even Brad Marshall is kind of in this world. He's kind of figuring it out. He's coming at it from left field. He was the guy with the croissant diet. But why don't you just explain your background really quickly and what is the bioenergetic way of eating and living, I guess you could say.
Sure. So, my background, I've been interested in health, fitness, nutrition from a young age and experimenting since then, with an interest, as an athlete and also doing some bodybuilding and things like that, never competing. But that was kind of where the interest came, and went through a lot of the dietary iterations that most people do, from the typical whole grain, low fat sort of approach, and then kind of on from there and into low carb, into paleo, intermittent fasting, the whole kind of gamut, ketogenic diets, cyclical ketogenic diets. And at the same time, I was pre-med and planning to go to medical school, and wasn't at the kind of peak health that I was anticipating or expecting, with how much effort I was putting in, and the fact that I was doing everything right based on what I was told. And so started questioning things a little bit, and struggling in terms of energy and focus. Wasn't getting the results in the gym that I could have, which I definitely realized after the fact. I didn't necessarily know it so much at the time. And some smaller things, libido wasn't where it could have or should have been, and some chronic infections, just some random, not random, but some symptoms that had been cropping up. And around that time, came across the bioenergetic view of health. And one of the, I'll kind of explain the overview of what that is, but one of the features there involves eating more carbohydrates. And at the time, beyond all those other symptoms, I was feeling very restricted and had pretty intense carb cravings. And so I was very excited at the prospect of being able to include those, and those actually being something that was conducive to health, as opposed to the enemy that caused insulin resistance and cancer and heart disease and everything else. And jumped in from there, and did a lot of experimenting along the way, and that kind of shifted my view on health, and changed now the way that I work with people as a health coach, and the focus of my research. And that's kind of led to where I am now.
Well, it's great. Yeah, it sounds like you've been exploring different dietary patterns for quite a while. Did you ever do sort of more like meat-based ancestral diets? Have you? Yeah, I just want to know what else you did.
So I was definitely, paleo was kind of gaining traction at the time when I was doing some of those experiments. So the paleo ancestral type diet, carnivore and the meat-based specifically weren't as prominent at the time. And we're talking, I don't know, 8 to 10 years ago. And so it wasn't something that I had come across. Of course, there were people doing it, but so I never did a pure carnivore. I was doing, full keto at points, definitely meat based, eating organ meats and things like that, but never did a pure carnivore diet.
Oh, me either. I'm not saying you should have. Some people online think I'm a carnivore guy just because I talk about meat a lot. I'm friends with the carnivore people, but I mean, I never even did full keto. Really, I would do it a bit cyclically. Talk about it, on the weekends. I would kind of carb up a bit. All this stuff for me is an experiment. Sounds like same thing with you. You're always open to new ideas. I joke around these days. I'm in camp, no camp, which is a camp, I guess. You could, uh, but I'm always exploring all the options. I don't want to be the one with some bias or agenda or preconceived notions, because that's going to screw everyone else. Because I feel like I'm kind of the communicator role. I actually just put out the intro to the Food Lies film, which is now a 6-part series, and that's the whole point, is we're looking at all sides, where I'm just exploring it. I don't want to pigeonhole myself or the audience into one way of eating, because humans are super diverse and we've evolved all over the world in all different climates and conditions. And we'll get into all this stuff too. But I was just curious, how you've gone, the path you've gone down, and if you've gone, I mean, there's even the new one, like Saladino, friend of mine, right? He's doing like nose to tail animal plus fruit, right? So it could be considered a pro metabolic approach, just with the, heavy animal foods, and it's like a sort of a restrictive version, right? It's a very narrow version of that, and I don't know. I just think they're all interesting, right? All these diets are super interesting, and there's so much to learn, and that's why we jumped on the phone a few times the 9 months ago to explore it. And I'm glad I kind of got more into this approach. I've heard about Ray Peat a lot over the years. People have been sending me his stuff. I've been looking into him for many years, and I've always been interested. And then I got more and more into this stuff, and I guess I did see Paul Saladino kind of go this way, and then there was like other people influencing my life, and it's just such a great journey, and I'm glad that I didn't have any hard lines in the sand about things. So then I had to backtrack. I was always open to all these diets, and I even my first podcast 5 years ago, I interviewed vegans, my vegan friends, and talking about that there's different ways it could work. And yeah, you know that I've done a lot of episodes, even with Denise Minger. I think it was episode 7. She was like, "Yeah, you can eat fruit and starches and organ meats and get your protein and get your nutrients." I was like, "Oh wow, that's amazing," and it was all good. So I'm gonna end this long-winded rant about this, and I guess we could jump back into more specifics of the pro-metabolic approach and why carbs can be very beneficial to people, and what type of carbs you're even referring to.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe a good place to start is what exactly, at least I'm referring to when I say the bioenergetic approach. And so basically the idea here is that this isn't just looking at nutrition, but rather health as a whole, or even beyond that, everything from evolution to, you know, biology as a whole. And the idea being that the availability of energy is what translates to health. So if we have a lot of energy available, it allows for greater complexity and function. And if we have less energy available, it leads to degeneration and dysfunction. And this is something that is a lens that you can see, you can look at pretty much any disease process through. You see it in neurodegenerative states, see it in fatty liver disease, in insulin resistance and diabetes and heart disease. You see that at least from my view, that the root of all of these issues comes back to a lack of energy on that cellular level, right? So we're talking about ATP levels, among other things, but we can kind of keep it simple at ATP. And that the main considering that this is the main driver of our health, we want to orient our environment, the food we're eating, exercise, sleep, supplements, and on from there toward things that will increase the amount of energy we have available to improve our function. So that's the kind of basis for the bioenergetic view.
That's great. Yeah, you're down to the mitochondria level and the ATP, and so maybe just explain an example of how that would work with someone who would develop a certain type of disease and why that is the problem.
Sure. So we have this assumption that the food that we take in automatically becomes energy. And in reality, when looking at mitochondrial respiration, there's a lot of steps there, and there's a lot of things that can cause issues with that process, whether it's a nutrient deficiency, various heavy metals, various toxins that we produce, hormones that all will regulate, block, or support that process. And so in, let's say, fatty liver disease, you have a situation where in the liver is not able to effectively produce energy from the carbohydrate, let's say fructose, that's coming into the liver. So it ends up converting a lot of it toward fat, to the point where then there's an accumulation of fat at the liver. With that lack of energy, you also end up seeing a lot of oxidative stress. And if that continues, you'll end up seeing an inflamed liver, and eventually it'll get worse and worse. You'll see fibrosis and scarring and eventually cancer. And when you pick apart what's going on there, it's not just that there is fructose or just that there's excess fat. And in fact, it's maybe worth mentioning that most of the fat in fatty liver actually comes from our own fat stores. More than 50%, about 60% of the fat that's in the fatty liver is from our own fat stores. But the problem there is that we're not converting that fuel to energy. And in this case, you have a buildup of the fuel and then a buildup of inflammation and oxidative stress that creates the fatty liver state. And you can break down everything from high blood pressure, heart disease, a neurodegenerative condition, and on from there to issues with producing energy and with energy availability.
What would be the example in insulin resistance? That's a big one.
Yeah, so what is frequently said, told, what is described, especially in the lower carb community. And this was something I subscribed to too. I was definitely on board with this idea that the problem in insulin resistance is that we have used insulin so much by having so many carbohydrates that our cells decide that they can't respond. They'd stop responding as sensitively to the insulin. So it takes more and more insulin to get the same response. And I would largely say that that is completely missing the mark of what the actual problem is in insulin resistance. And I would say that insulin resistance itself is a complete misnomer. And rather, what's happening is that for various reasons, the cells are not able to metabolize the glucose that's coming into them. And so instead of using that glucose to produce energy, there's a buildup of glucose inside the cell. And when there's a buildup of glucose, it's much harder to force more glucose from the blood into the tissues, into the cells. And so it requires a stronger signal, more insulin, to force that glucose in because the cell it's already saturated, it's already got enough glucose. So there's a ton of reasons why this happens. There's a lot of evidence for this. I'm happy to talk through it as much as you'd like, but that is the idea in insulin resistance is actually it's an issue of glucose metabolism. We're not metabolizing that glucose well, and that's leading to an insulin resistant state.
Well, yeah, please go further. See, why would it not be able to utilize the glucose?
So we could keep it as simple as just a nutrient deficiency. B vitamins are super important for converting glucose to ATP. If we don't have enough B1 or B3, we can't efficiently undergo that process. So normally there are more complex things going on. So there's other things in our environment, like if we're taking in a lot of those seed oils, a lot of the polyunsaturated fats, those are pretty good at driving a state that impairs glucose oxidation, glucose metabolism. So that would be another huge one. We're eating a lot of seed oils. We're not getting enough nutrients in. If we're just in a generalized stress state, so if we've got a ton of cortisol for various reasons, that's going to block our glucose metabolism as well. So and we can go on and on, but so there's all these different reasons that we can have these issues with converting that glucose to energy. And then we end up seeing this symptom of elevated blood glucose and elevated insulin as the problem, when in reality, it's just a symptom of what's going on at the tissues. And so it leads to all sorts of kind of wacky approaches to trying to resolve this issue, just in the same way that we look at cholesterol and heart disease. And there's this idea that just the higher level of cholesterol in the blood meant that it would drive heart disease. And so we just have to lower that with a statin. We've ended up doing a lot of the same thing with insulin resistance and diabetes. And so really need to be looking at the root of what's going on there. And, there's a handful of things. So another interesting piece that's going on in diabetes and insulin resistance is because you have this lack of energy, you have excess stress hormones being produced, a lot of cortisol. You also have a lot of adrenaline and a lot of glucagon. And those lead to gluconeogenesis at the liver. So a lot of times when you see elevated fasting blood sugar in insulin resistance and diabetes, it's not because of any glucose that's coming in. That's a glucose that we're producing ourselves through gluconeogenesis at the liver because of the stress hormones, because of the cortisol and glucagon and adrenaline. And when we inject insulin or give somebody insulin in that state, it's actually working by stopping the gluconeogenesis, and that's helping to bring the blood sugar down as opposed to even increasing the glucose uptake at the cell. So just kind of another feature of insulin resistance that's largely kind of ignored and very much points in favor of this being really a glucose metabolism issue.
That's super interesting. So to be clear and back up a little bit, I know the pro-metabolic stance of the low-carb diet is not addressing the root cause of the problem. And so this kind of makes sense, and hopefully makes sense to the audience that, well, the low-carb crowd is into looking at the root cause of the problem, theoretically, right? But maybe they didn't go deep enough. And that one way to solve the problem is to just not eat carbs, right? But then again, it's just like a Band-Aid, just like you made the comparison to taking statins, right? And it's the same thing. It's like the low keto community, whatever it's called, they're always like, don't blame the cholesterol. You don't blame the firefighters for the fire and all that type of stuff. Or like, just looking at one marker and you're not looking at all that stuff. So so you agree with like all of that. And then you just take it a step further where we're going is, I get it. You can reverse diabetes, or I guess put it into temporary remission and lose weight and stop using insulin and do all these things. But maybe there's a better solution than just not eating carbs.
Yeah, thank you for putting those pieces together in the kind of big picture way, because that's 100% it, right? So we're seeing this elevated glucose as the problem, but it's just the symptom. And as you said, we can put a band-aid on it by avoiding the carbohydrates, but we haven't fixed that root issue. We aren't using the carbohydrates any better. We're just avoiding it. And yes, it'll help with symptoms. And yes, it can help with weight loss. And there's a ton of reasons for that. Obviously, people have benefits on low carb diets. I'm not about to pretend that that never happens, but I would argue that there are reasons for that outside of just avoiding carbs. And part of that could just be that we're in some ways avoiding this issue, but also we have some benefits to the gut, some benefits in a state where, again, if we're not using those carbs well, it's better to run on fat and ketones than to poorly use glucose. But again, that doesn't mean glucose was the problem. It just means we had a glucose metabolism issue. So yeah, thanks for bringing up that point.
Well, yeah, no, and also I'm not knocking low carb diets either. It's like maybe it's just 90% of the way there, and you could be eating a lot of good foods and getting a lot of good nutrition and avoiding a lot of seed oils and PUFAs by going on these diets, and it's ancestral. So yeah, I'm all about it. I guess it's just like, let's take care of that last 10%, heal your metabolism, quotes, heal your metabolism, or make your energy production more efficient and better, and then we can be eating good whole food carbs or other sources. And we will get into the source of carbs still later, but we still got to get into these details of just the higher level situation. Do we have that so far? I mean, anything else you want to add in?
No, I think, yeah, I think that covers it. Of course, it's really, there's so much to dig into, right? We can look at each disease process. We were just talking insulin resistance. We can look at high blood pressure through the same lens. We can look at all the, and it's really interesting to do so and to see how directly connected it is to low ATP levels, lack of glucose metabolism, elevated stress hormones. Those, we see those pieces everywhere. And a lot of times it is worth mentioning too, that in that state, our bodies resort to fat oxidation. Most of those states are not states where we're relying on glucose, the whole metabolic inflexibility idea that we're stuck in a glucose burning state. If you look at what's actually going on in the tissues, pretty much any degenerative state involves excess fat oxidation and impaired glucose metabolism. So again, it's just a matter of, I think, as you said, digging down into what the root really is in those situations.
Well, we should go through some of them. I want to tie up the fructose thing and the fatty liver because, yeah, there's a lot of doctors in the more keto community that just blame fructose 100%. And it's just interesting that, the Saladinos out there eating tons of fruit, or whoever else, it's like, hey, this is not a problem. How does that work?
Yeah, so a lot of the people against consuming fructose have painted a picture where it's as simple as the fructose comes in, we can only handle so much. And so anytime we take in a little bit extra, it goes right to our livers, it's converted to fat, and then that fat builds up. And that's definitely what happens when you're looking at rats who are given terrible diets or who are given ridiculous doses of fructose. Sometimes it's injected, sometimes they're given just pure fructose. Those things happen. Like you will
They're
see the
already on these
inflammation.
like soybean oil diets too. Just to make it clear, they're on like high PUFA diets.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's terrible what what they're fed, and yeah, and then you inject them with fructose, you give them huge boluses, which doesn't have anything to do with how we eat fructose. We never eat fructose alone; it's always in combination with glucose, and that's an important piece because we need both glucose and fructose to absorb the fructose in the intestines. And when we have a lot of fructose and no glucose, it's not going to get absorbed. What's going to happen is it actually passes through the intestines toward the large intestine and feeds bacteria. They produce all sorts of toxic components, and that alone is enough to drive fatty liver disease. So they've actually done these studies in rats where they give them the same excessive amounts of fructose, but they also give them antibiotics to clear out their intestines, and they don't get fatty liver disease. And that is just one way to stop the fatty liver effect from fructose in these rat studies. Another is actually removing or blocking the metabolites of the polyunsaturated fats. So they'll use something that'll inhibit the inflammatory downstream products of the polyunsaturated fats, and that'll prevent the inflammation and fat production at the liver, again, given the same amount of fructose. So there's quite a few confounding variables there. What it essentially ends up coming down to is that if we're generally healthy and we're eating fructose in normal foods the way that we would normally eat them, it's really not a problem at all. It doesn't increase de novo lipogenesis to any major extent. And even in the degenerative states, A, I think it's important to note that the fructose isn't causing it. And B, it's still a minor player. As I mentioned before, the studies looking at the actual fat composition of the liver find that over 60% or about 60% of it comes from our own adipose tissue. So what that means is that we're in this state of systemic stress, a systemic metabolic problem that is causing the release of stress hormones to increase lipolysis at the fat stores to release the fat into the bloodstream. And that's being picked up by the liver and stored as fat. And that's way larger of a component than the carbs we eat. The carbs we eat only, again, in a fatty liver state, only ends up being about 25% of the fat stored in the liver. So there's a lot more to the picture than just taking in fructose. Fructose is a metabolic poison and it goes to fat.
So the audience might be thinking now, but what about the difference between a metabolically healthy person? This is the feedback I get a lot too. And maybe people even say myself why I can do fine with carbs. So, because you're athletic, you're metabolically healthy, you're relatively young, all that type of stuff. Saladino is the same. He's like out there surfing 3 hours a day and lifting weights or whatever else he does. So is there a difference in all of these things between a metabolically damaged person, someone with insulin resistance, or any number of other diseases, and a super healthy, young and fit person?
There's definitely a difference. And so if someone is far down on that insulin resistance spectrum, maybe toward the type 2 diabetes, and you just add carbs on top of what they're doing, they're not going to respond that well to them. And that's why we need to get at that root. We need to fix the problems with the carb metabolism and increase the carbs to tolerance in that case. I think most people can tolerate a pretty considerable amount of carbs, but if there's issues with glucose metabolism, you might want to titrate based on where you feel best. And of course, there's always a caveat there where if you're on a low carb diet and your cheat meal is carb based and you don't feel good, that doesn't mean it's just the carbs. It could also be the various other things that might have been in the foods that were your cheat meal, whether it's unsaturated fats or processed flours or whatever. But yes, we want to be tailoring to our carb tolerance, but we also want to focus on fixing that glucose metabolism so we can include more carbohydrates.
Okay. Yeah. So, man, so many questions. So what the difference between the carbohydrates? I guess we can start there because you mentioned flour. Like I don't think either of us are a fan of flour. So a lot of people just lump in carbs and then they're all being the same. Like you also said, you eat like some sort of ridiculous treat on the weekends and then you blame it on the carb, but it's like there's so much more to it.
Yeah, definitely. So as you were kind of saying before, maybe helping to bridge the gap with a lot of people who are thinking about this more in terms of whether it's low carb or ancestral health, that I'm not saying, refined carbohydrates are a friend, or refined, processed grains, or even whole grains for that matter, or legumes or raw vegetables. Like I'm not suggesting those as our main carb sources. What I do normally recommend, or what I think are the more optimal sources, are ripe fruits and kind of the offshoot, maybe more processed versions of those, whether it's dried fruit or frozen fruit or fruit juice, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Roots and tubers, potatoes, sweet potatoes, yucca, on from there. And those really being the main sources. I think some well-processed, traditionally prepared grains are okay as well, whether it's nixtamalized corn or sprouted oats potentially. I think those are still kind of a little bit more in the gray area. I think most people do better with fewer of those, but a lot of people do totally fine with them. So those would be, in general, the types of carbohydrates I'd be kind of looking at. Honey and maple syrup as well. I know you mentioned Paul Saladino a few times. So he's, obviously evaluating carbohydrate intake in terms of the least toxic ones with the most nutrition. And so I know he's a little, he has a little bit more of a gripe with the root vegetables, for example, than I do. But that would be my general take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're all generally on the same page. You said, none of these refined grains, probably not whole grains, probably not the legumes, probably not raw vegetables. Yeah, we're all on the same page there. And even with the carb sources, yes, I'm into fruit. I'm into just the natural versions. I think even the honey has other nutrients in it. It is, a natural food. It has some benefits, and it actually doesn't have the most carbs in it too. If you actually look at it like per like a teaspoon of honey, it's not the most. But I do test stuff with a CGM because I get them for free sometimes and it's fun. And I can see that some things spike my blood sugar more than others, which leads us into the fruit juice. which is probably our only disagreement, is fruit juice. So what would you say about orange juice? Why is it great? And what about the blood sugar?
So we can look at it just on the biochemical differences between fruit juice and fruit, which I think is helpful. I think it's also worth mentioning. Ripeness is really important with fruit, and it's sometimes tough to find ripe, fresh fruit depending on where you're located and what's available. And I don't think that means that we shouldn't be eating fruit. Some people are of the belief that we need to eat based on what's always locally available, and we can discuss that too. But the the nice thing about juice is it can be packaged when the fruit is very ripe and it has a good shelf life. So it's always good quality, very low in any potential toxic components. So I think that there's that benefit there that is worth highlighting. But if we're just comparing what is the difference between juice and whole fruit, really the difference is the fiber, right? We're not getting the fiber with the whole fruit. And that is going to lead to quicker carbohydrate uptake. If we, had equal amounts of each, we're going to have generally more of a spike in glucose and faster intake or faster absorption of glucose and fructose from the juice versus the whole fruit. If it's in the context of a whole meal and it's someone who is pretty insulin sensitive, I don't see that. I see that very rarely to be an issue. And even in someone who is struggling with insulin resistance, I've seen fruit juice not to be a problem at all. I've still seen people fully reverse fatty liver disease while they're having fruit juice. And so there are some concerns for someone who is not as their glucose metabolism is struggling a little bit more. I think that's a valid point. And so I would want to be a little bit more careful when it comes to fruit juice versus whole fruit in that case. But I think if we're addressing the root pieces there, it's rarely an issue that I see, or at least if it's taken in moderate amounts with other foods.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I definitely like to do it with other foods, and there's, like Glucose Goddess on Instagram, people might have seen, and she does all these different tests, and you can see, yes, if you're eating some fat and protein first, and then you eat the carbs, there's a lower glucose response. This is all the stuff. There's so many tips. You can go for a walk after, and it helps lower it. You can, um, yeah, well, the more processed it is, the more of a spike it is. So I generally am a fan to eat it in the whole food matrix. I did a podcast with Gabor Adosi years and years ago about this, and it's just pretty interesting how aligned it is with the more processed the food is, kind of the worse the response in your blood glucose is. But I am open to, yeah, kind of what you're saying, where in the context of a meal, but I just don't really get this idea that all of a sudden blood glucose spikes don't matter, because they still do happen. And I know the bioenergetic world, it does seem like they will be eating fruit or juice on its own, and it does seem like they want you to eat like every 5 hours. It's like a full circle back to the food pyramid, or like, the guidelines. Get your metabolism going every 3 hours. And I don't know if these people like you or others, look at a CGM, or what they say about it, or what are those long-term effects. I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but like, I mean, I've tried this stuff, and if I keep eating, it's like my blood glucose will be all over the place. Like, it would be very good. Like, I'm metabolically flexible. Like, I think I have great glucose metabolism, and I can eat a bunch of carbs and it can go up and come right back down, like super healthy. Like, all this stuff looks good. But then on days, if I'm trying to do all this with the different, sources of carbs, my blood sugar would just be all over the place all day.
So you mentioned two different pieces there, right? So one is the types of carbs coming in, and our blood glucose spikes an issue, and how do we regulate our blood sugar, and then also the food or meal or snack frequency. So just to touch on that first part, I think so we of course want to be a little bit specific as far as a glucose spike. I'm not saying we should be seeing glucose levels in the 200s, but I'm generally not concerned about a very short-term spike that comes down quickly, because normally it's a feature of two things. How high the spike goes is a feature of how glucose sensitive we are and the types of carbohydrates that are coming in. And so if we're eating a ton of plain honey plus juice, it's going to spike a lot. That's just the nature of what we ate. That's not necessarily a problem. If it's coming down quickly, it's just that means that glucose was not hanging in the blood for long because our tissues took it up right away and are using it. So I'm not so concerned about a very short-term spike. And I think most of the concern when it comes to the elevated blood sugar over time is more of a representation of, or an assumption based on what it normally represents, which is someone who is insulin resistant. But I don't think having those spikes in someone who's glucose sensitive is a problem. And there is considerable research suggesting that some spikes like that are entirely normal in people who are metabolically healthy, and that it doesn't actually contribute at all to disease processes. So it's tough to isolate those variables when most of the people who have elevated blood sugar and a lot of those spikes are the people who are doing the standard American deal and they're already not metabolically healthy. But I'm not concerned about a temporary spike on its own. I don't see that as an issue.
Well, to finish this point, but I mean, if you had 5 spikes per day, or if you go, especially if you go too high up, you can come back down and go below baseline. You can go hypoglycemic. So, I mean, how would that not be a problem? It seems. I mean, I get it. Like, we can't say that it's causal because yes, it's the people have all the other problems, but it just doesn't seem great to be bouncing your blood sugar all over the place and even feel great.
So I don't think it's good to be going hypoglycemic. And so if someone is experiencing spike plus crash, I would say that's different from someone who has a momentary spike, but as they continue to digest and absorb their food, their blood sugar stays balanced. They're never getting that dip. They're never getting the following response in terms of cortisol or other stress hormones. So yeah, not saying that we want to have spike and crash, but momentary spike that then kind of evens out, I think is more just a feature in someone who's metabolically healthy, is more just a feature of the type of carbs that came in. And I do work with people who use CGMs. I never have personally, but work with people who use CGMs who are eating this way. And there are the people who are struggling in terms of their glucose metabolism, and you see that reflected in the CGM, and they aren't going to feel as good at certain points here. And they tend not to do as well with large amounts of fruit juice or honey or something like that in a meal. But there's also the people who are totally fine and working well metabolically, and they'll have that spike and they don't feel any negative effect. They just see it on the CGM, when they're looking back, and their blood sugar was pretty balanced after. It was just kind of a momentary blip.
I don't think I ever have those dips, and I actually feel fine. I think I've changed my diet over the course of the last 7 or 8 years, so I hope it's working. But yeah, I guess I do agree that I personally cannot feel bad after eating certain things, right? I can have a blood sugar spike, eat something like honey or some sort of ice cream, like a clean ice cream, and feel fine.
Yeah, and I think that's, we don't want ice cream to be our main source, but I don't see such an issue with ice cream, right? We're looking at milk and eggs and a bit of salt and some sugar. I don't think, it's the worst thing.
Oh, I'm on board. I'm on board for sure, So then what are the problems? Like, what are the other things that you didn't get to that we were going to break down?
So we mentioned food frequency. I don't know if you want to come back there or talk more through problems with what an average person's doing or other areas to explore as far as what could be causing issues in terms of our metabolism. Things like gut health being a huge one, nutrient deficiencies, and on from there.
Well, yeah, we'll get to those ones after. I guess we should finish off on the food frequency because it's just going to throw the audience for a loop. They're like, oh, now we're back at eating 5 times a day. And like, do you have to, like, is that necessary too?
So normally my recommendation, what I think tends to be ideal, is eating every 3 to 5 hours. So yes, that's maybe taking us back to the old school fitness days, bodybuilding days. And I guess food pyramid too. I don't know if they really have a food frequency recommendation, but the reason why I tend to recommend that, assuming that somebody's eating carbohydrates, is that after normally around that time, if we aren't taking something in to keep that blood sugar stable, it will start to come down and become hypoglycemic. This is going to happen faster if we're exercising. We're going to use that blood glucose faster, or if we're really mentally active or anything like that, if we're walking. But in general, that is kind of the next piece that will happen. And so if that occurs, then we have to rely on the release of the stress hormones in order to bring that blood sugar up. This is because blood sugar levels have to be maintained, at least a substantial amount, because if not, if there's no blood glucose there, we'll die. Our brain won't have any glucose and everything turns off. So we need to have these counter-regulatory mechanisms, and these are through stress hormones in order to maintain blood sugar. And my issue with those stress hormones is that they act as a signal that there's not food coming in and that we need to be dipping into our stores. And they don't just affect our blood sugar, but they then affect other areas as well. So they're going to reduce our thyroid hormone conversion, the conversion from the inactive T4 to the active T3. They're going to reduce our steroid hormone production, and they're going to reduce our digestive activity and on from there. And we know this if we're looking at really extreme levels of cortisol. We see this very clearly in like a Cushing's syndrome situation. And so that's my issue with relying on those stress hormones. And whether we're on a low carb diet or we're on a high carb diet, but we go a super long time without eating or fasting, all those are situations where we have to rely on the stress hormones to maintain the blood sugar. And again, that acts as a signal that there's not food coming in and turns our metabolism down, whether it's through all these means, through the means of reducing the conversion of the thyroid hormones, turning down reproductive hormones like for men testosterone, and slowing down other areas of our other systems of our body.
So yeah, got to pause for a second because this might be hurting people's heads. That with the low carb diet. So just explain, because we didn't actually squarely hit this point or this theory that when people who do keto diets think they're doing a good thing, but with autophagy, with not eating all the time, all these things, and you're saying that could be potentially bad because it's turning on stress hormones. So explain that for the people.
So this happens both with carbohydrates and fats. If we aren't taking in enough carbs or enough fats, our blood glucose will drop or our blood fatty acids will drop. When either of those things happen, it turns on a counter-regulatory system, which is these stress hormones, to bring those levels back up. And it's because these things are essential. Whether we're eating them or not, we need fat for all sorts of functions. We use it as a fuel, but we also use it structurally and hormonally and digestively. And the same goes for carbohydrates, something that's used structurally, but also, of course, as an energy source. And so anytime these things drop too low, we have a stress response. So
why are they stress hormones, and why is it necessarily a stress response? Because it sounds like you're saying, like, is it scientifically a stress response? Because I think the keto docs will say, I mean, this is just what happens. Ketones are good. There's all these other ways to look at it.
So the reason why I would at least categorize them as a stress response is because they're the same hormones that are produced during stress, whether it's psychological stress or going for a run or anything else that is depleting the fuel and energy that's available. It releases the exact same hormones, the glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol. And so that's what I'm characterizing as stress, is a low energy, low fuel state. And that's when these are produced, and they're produced whether we're exercising or whether we just don't eat for a while, or whether we don't eat carbs or whether we don't eat fat. All of those are scenarios where it'll increase the production of these hormones. Now, most people who are in favor of ketogenic diets acknowledge that this happens at least short term, right? So the process of getting into ketosis tends to require sorry about my cat. So the process of getting into ketosis requires considerable releases of these stress hormones. And that's generally acknowledged in that short term that there's going to be elevated, especially cortisol, but also the adrenaline and glucagon. After that point, you don't see chronically high levels of cortisol or chronically high levels of adrenaline. That's acknowledged. What you do typically see is chronically high levels of glucagon. And then I would say that you are more susceptible to increases in adrenaline and cortisol. And so this is kind of getting into nitty-gritty details here, but I would still categorize glucagon in that same stress hormone category. It still is, and actually is really the primary characterizing feature of diabetes. Insulin resistance is actually hyperglucagonemia. That's the one that's leading to all the excess production of glucose at the liver and is largely representative of the stress state. And so I think that there's a major issue there, and that glucagon alone is enough to turn down the conversion of thyroid hormones, for example. So it still has those same effects systemically in terms of turning down our metabolism. And so when we're in a low carb state, we have to rely on that glucagon. It's not as much as when we first shifted because we're relying way more on fat and ketones, but even in order to produce those ketones, we need to have glucagon. So I take issue with relying on the glucagon. And then the next issue that I have is we are basically, if we're in a low carb state, we're already a step into stress. So we maybe haven't hit the adrenaline and cortisol at rest, but we're already at the glucagon stage. And so then if we add activity or we add any sort of stressor, we already have dipped into that first layer, and then we have to go much quicker to adrenaline and to cortisol. And there's also more sensitivity to those things and less breakdown of those things at the tissues. So this is something, again, seen in the research where when looking at like athletes on a low carb diet or the response to exercise on a low carb diet, it tends to involve more sympathetic activity, more of the activity of the stress systems. And so that's where I tend to take issue, is that that is a mediating mechanism that leads to turning down things metabolically, turning down thyroid activity, reproductive hormone activity, and on from there. And just to kind of bring it full circle, to kind of zoom out and look at it from the big picture, and maybe this will help people internalize this because it can get confusing. We're just talking hormones and blood sugar. These are mechanisms that I view as entirely biologically and evolutionarily consistent, where if we don't have enough food available, whether we're starving or it's a famine or we're intentionally fasting, our body recognizes that as a threat, that there's not enough food coming in. And so it needs to turn down its metabolism so that it can survive for longer. If it keeps burning the same amount of fuel, we'll die very quickly. We'll run out of fuel very quickly. And so this is a natural response to those states. And we know that a low carb diet mimics that same state of fasting and starvation. And so this is just what I kind of was talking to, is just the mechanism through which that's happening. But I think if our goal is to increase energy availability and improve our metabolism, that's directly contradictory with the processes of turning those things down.
Yeah, I think that's how I first got interested in this a few years ago, because I noticed there was a thing a bit consistent in the keto community or low carb community or carnivore, was that people did have lower thyroid, or they're cold, or cold hands and feet, or trouble sleeping, and or low body temperature. Like, these are pretty consistent, and you can't just say, oh well, you didn't do it right. So you can't be like vegans too, or we make fun of vegans, but that's a different story, because I just don't think you can do it right. But I so you're kind of saying, or the pro metabolic view is, it's not that you're just not doing it right, it's it's a feature, not a bug. It's like you are, even if you are doing it right, you are creating this lower energy state, this compensatory reaction that your body's having. Is like, hey, we're not getting enough energy, food is not abundant, we need to slow down our metabolism, slow down our thyroid, lower our body temperature, all that type of stuff. And I feel like I've seen people in the keto world, if they go keto for too long, they can only eat a very small amount of calories. Maybe they're like, if they like over 1,400 calories, they can gain weight, because it's just their body has just slowed down so much. And this is what we talked about with Brad Marshall a long time ago. Is that we used to be able to eat more calories. He was showing like that we used to be eating, men would eat like 3,000 calories a day back in the early 1900s. And this is making more sense to me. I got a temperature, I got this little thermometer, and I've been taking my temperature. And yeah, I mean, it is kind of dose dependent. It's like, if you eat more carbs over the course of the day, or the week, your temperature will go up. And it kind of makes sense bioenergetically or physics wise. We're not destroying, the laws of the universe. It's that it's not, we're saying that, well, the calorie balance story is a long one, and we can talk about calories in and calories out, but it makes sense with the equation where you can eat more food if it's the right food and your metabolism is working correctly, but not gain weight, because you're just outputting more energy. Your body is just burning it as heat.
Yeah, and producing ATP from it as well. But yeah, the heat is an important byproduct too, and seeing the low versus high body temperatures is certainly an important piece there. And yeah, a lot of the people I'm working with are people who are recovering from all those symptoms you described, whether it's really not eating much and a very low appetite from the kind of low carb type approach for a very long time, or it's the low body temperature or the tanking of testosterone and other sex hormones, which I know you had mentioned Paul Saladino before, and I remember him talking about thyroid and androgens, I think, taking a hit when he was not incorporating the carbohydrates. And that was one of the main things that had led him to incorporate more. And yeah, it's something that I see all the time and totally makes sense in terms of what our bodies would do biologically when they're not in a state of abundant food. I mean, that's not a state of reproduction. It's not a state of building and creating and really great cognitive work and all of that. It's a state of contraction and conserving energy as much as possible until we are in an abundant environment again.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And that's what I was saying in the beginning. There's humans lived all over the world in all different climates and conditions, and we're adaptable. And yes, we could have lived for long times on just meat and fat, or we could have lived long times on just fruit if we had to. That's why the fruitarian diet semi works for a year, because it's like, well, I don't want to say it works, but you know what I mean? Like people don't die. It's because we've adapted to be able to go through these times of starvation or stress. So I get it. And I guess my next kind of line of thinking is how to use these different approaches, or just how I can make sense of them all and still make it make sense ancestrally, is that, and also going back to the disease process, right? There's different people in different states of ill health and metabolism where we can still use certain interventions or certain diets. And I guess you a little bit said about titrating, carbs back in, but I guess I'm in a roundabout way saying, if I see someone who's 300 pounds and say I'm working with Dr. Gary, and I still would recommend leaning into protein and satiety and not having all those sweets around and doing more ketogenic approach. There's like a stage, maybe even there's an introductory stage where we're just like, okay, let's just cut out seed oils and refined grains. That's it. We'll just cut out anything in a package. And then we can go more lean into, we can go bit sort of animal based, with some low carb veg, or just like fermented, whatever, like some, avocado or something, or like a sauerkraut. Then we heal your or we, I don't know, we're healing your gut. We're getting you, say, maybe your gut microbiome to change. We're doing a lot of things, maybe getting you away from a food addiction. Then we can start adding back in the whole food carbs. Do you think that could work as like sort of a progression?
Yeah, it always depends on where someone's at. And I think for the vast majority of people who are, you know, kind of the person who's fallen into just average eating, they go to the grocery store and get what tastes good and it's the packaged foods and things. I don't think for most of them, they need to avoid those whole food carbs even early on. If they just move to whole foods, I think that tends to lead to some pretty dramatic benefits. And there are certainly situations where maybe you want to be careful there, but I think they're probably pretty few and far between from my view. If we're changing things, intentionally, like making good choices and everything. But yeah.
But then, so yeah, I agree. If you're just like sort of an average person, that's why Whole30 is a great diet, Whole30 is a great intervention. But then what about say the 300-pound person, an example?
Yeah, so even in like that situation, I think, not that this is the strongest argument, but I don't think what got that person there was eating too much fruit. And I think if they just went to eating more protein, as you said, like get those really nutrient dense animal based protein sources in, remove the polyunsaturated fats, especially the seed oils, stop with the processed foods, the processed grains. I don't think it's going to be harmful at that point to also include even cooked vegetables and whole fruits and maybe some cooked roots and tubers. Maybe there's a small portion of people where even that is too much in terms of carbohydrates if they're really insulin resistant. And that's like, yes, we need to titrate based on where they're at, but I think it's pretty rare where that's really even necessary to go any lower than that.
Well, the thing I've just dealt with a different crowd. Maybe I sort of worked as a health coach a bit, worked with Dr. Gary, and and probably I'm going to get all these comments on this episode about how I'm an insane person and that I'm just some fit, lucky, health, young person that can eat whatever they want. And they're just like, you don't know about food addiction. You don't know about what happens if I eat this fruit. They have all these different experiences. And the one thing I really do appreciate is that sort of energy around food, or if you call it a food addiction. It's like if fruit's on the table, if you're saying, oh, you can eat sweet potatoes, you can eat fruit, any whole food's good. I just don't know if it works for some people.
Yeah, it's hard to encompass all of someone's history and make blanket statements. I'm sure there are cases where just doing that is not going to work so well. I do want to say, maybe as a counterpoint, I know people who have come from low carb, and then when they go to bring carbs in again, they feel out of control with them and they feel like they're going to eat all of them. And it's really hard to fight those cravings. And there's something to be said for that, but I don't think it's because the carbs are the problem. I think that that is your body screaming for something that it needs and hasn't had for a very long time. And it's my view is that it's always going to be better to get those carbs in at some point. It's going to happen at some time. So trying to do it in the way that you can do it in the most controlled, comfortable way is absolutely, I would say, paramount, right? And we don't want to do it in an out of control way. But there can be a period where that's going to be difficult. I know that I had that personally coming from low carb, that then there was a period where I couldn't get enough. Like I really needed to eat a ton. And then that stopped. It wasn't food addiction. It wasn't carb addiction. It wasn't sugar addiction. It was that my body actually needed a nutrient. Carbohydrate is a nutrient. Yes, we can produce it in the same way we can produce fat, but it's a nutrient. And so I know I was deprived of it for a very long time. And so having it back, it wasn't a psychological thing. It wasn't a taste thing. I mean, of course, taste is influenced by these, but my body needed it. And so there was a good period of time, several months, where I was eating pretty huge amounts of carbohydrates. And even after that, it wasn't like small, but I know for me, that was something I needed. And then after that, it became very clear it had nothing to do with an addiction. After that point, it was very easy to self-regulate. It didn't have to be something that I was psychologically restricting. It was just when my body had enough, it had enough. And I didn't want to just guzzle down orange juice all the time anymore. I didn't want to put 14 spoons of sugar in my coffee anymore, which was something that I actually did during that time prior. And now I would find that not to taste very good, to be very excessively sweet. But that was something that at the time I was so deprived that was actually something I was doing. And for me was part of that healing process. And again, had nothing to do with I guess what I'm kind of saying is I think just looking at it as sugar addiction and then having the sugar leads to this whirlwind of carbohydrate frenzies that never ends is not really the experience that I've had or that I see with my clients.
Well, yeah, that may just be your experience and you may self-selecting clients. I just
Sure.
think that is a huge issue. And I'm just thinking of all the people I know right now, just who have gone on their weight loss journeys or, man, it is not easy for some people.
Oh, I'm not trying to say it's easy at all. I guess what I'm saying is I think it's more physiological as opposed to a psychological problem. I'm sure there are exceptions. Without a doubt, I'm sure there are exceptions. But from my view, I think that this is coming more from a physiological need. And as that need gets satisfied, it should reduce the cravings and it should get to a more comfortable point. And I've worked with clients who were terrified of eating carbohydrates and eating some of these things because they knew that if they ate a bite of the pie or the cake, they would never stop and they would be eating until they felt like they could puke. And these same people were then several months later saying, I was at a birthday party and I decided to just have a piece of cake. And I was like, I was feeling weak and I said, screw it. And I had 2 bites and then I stopped. I didn't even want more. And this is coming from people who would have said that is not in the realm of possibility for me. So I'm not trying to discount anyone's experience. It's maybe just an alternative view to consider and an alternative lens to look at things through. And maybe it would lead to some sort of resolution or improvement in the situation. And I do think there's a very strong relationship. I mean, there's physiological basis for a need for carbohydrates, a need for ATP, and that being directly tied with our hunger signals and really our hunger signals not working. So when our hypothalamus in our brain doesn't have enough ATP, it can be getting all the leptin telling it that it doesn't need to eat more than it wants, but it won't actually be able to respond to it. And so that is creating a situation where someone feels like they're out of control and needs to overeat. And I think if we sort out the metabolic issues underlying, then it can actually resolve what feels like maybe a food or sugar addiction.
This is a good next topic and the energy regulation system in the body. But I do want to cap off this restriction stuff. I think you have a point. I'm not into restrictive diets and you want to do something for life. And some people don't feel restricted by just eating ancestral foods that don't include fruit, right? They're like, I'm fine with meat and fat. It's great. But then I also think that's why they have so much energy. Maybe that's the problem. They have so much energy around food because they are craving it so much and that it's just such this no thing. And then they get a little, it's like, oh man, I had 1 bite of sweet potato and then I was, at the Wendy's and I was guzzling this and that. So I think actually eating whole food, fruit, and say sweet potatoes could be actually a good thing because it is a healthy food source that would give your body a good source of carbs and what it wants. But then you wouldn't have to eat junk food, and you wouldn't eat right something worse, right? It could take the place of the highly processed bad food.
Oh, 100%. And I've definitely seen that as well. Again, someone who I was working with recently who couldn't have so many foods in the house because if he had even ice cream, even good quality ice cream in the house, he would finish the whole pint and maybe even want more. And he would have to force himself not to go get more because he would just keep eating. And then when fueling from better sources, as you're saying, whether it's sweet potatoes, fruits, white rice, maybe whatever it is, then no longer had that issue and was able to have the ice cream in his freezer and would have it and would maybe eat a third of it and wasn't saying, oh, I shouldn't eat more, and wasn't saying I need to put this away, but just didn't even want to eat more. And so yeah, I'd much prefer to be filling that need with the much better quality foods.
Yeah, well, that's where I've been at. I love that. It's same thing with like snacking. So I don't like to eat often. And I think it's good for people to at least go through a phase for maybe a year where they're not just constantly snacking. And I just like that where I don't have to use willpower to not snack. I'm just not hungry because if I'm eating the right foods, then I am correctly satiated. But yeah, we should get into the satiation part. It's satiety and the signaling in your body because yeah, I think this is so you sent me a bunch of papers that I never had time to look at 9 months ago about this type of stuff. But yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so the one thing that I think is, we're pointing to overeating as the major issue so many times. And I think we are not looking at what's actually driving our hunger signals very well. And there are some really interesting papers looking at this and that are saying that somebody who is, let's say, in that obese situation and they're not in a state of excess energy, they're not these, you don't see it like just in the way that they are behaving, they're not wanting to go for a run, they don't tend to have all this extra energy, the vast majority of people. And also physiologically you end up seeing the same thing. And so what some of this research has been showing is that they're dealing with metabolic issues where they're not converting that food well to energy. So their body is still saying, I need more food because the signals haven't been turned off. And so I missed a step there, which is that the hunger signals themselves are tied to the energy availability. So I mentioned the ATP levels in our hypothalamus, the ATP levels in our liver, those being the major sensors of whether our bodies are asking us for more food and whether they need more food. And so if you take this dysfunctional situation where the food's coming in, but not enough of it's being converted to ATP, there's all this extra that's being stored as fat because it's not being used to produce energy, but our bodies are still asking us for more and more. It's not because we have excess energy, it's because we're having issues converting that food to energy. So the signals for more food are still there, and we end up storing all this extra food as fat. And then we say the problem is we're taking in too much food. But really, the problem is that there are metabolic issues. And that's because I know we talk big pharma, big food, all the different reasons why our environment's absolutely destroyed and it's really hard to get good quality food, and all the advice that we're told and on has left us in this situation. And then we're told that we need to blame ourselves for just eating too much, when in reality, our hunger signals, our physiological hunger signals are telling us to eat more because they need the energy that they aren't getting.
Well, this is a great way to illustrate the problem. No one wants to be fat. No one wants to overeat, yet they do. And the bigger issue, there's all this fat on a person's body. Why can't they use it? So we're really getting to the heart of this. And this is why I don't like the guys like Lane Norton that are just saying, yeah, bro, you didn't count your calories good enough. But it's like, okay, this doesn't make any sense. There's a giant person that's 300 pounds. That's energy on their body. I know how humans work. We store energy so we can use it for later. Why can't that person use that energy, or why is the signaling messed up?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Uh, were you asking me like what
Yeah,
the
well,
issues
I
are?
mean,
Oh
just
yeah,
say it again. Yeah, just go into more detail. Like, why exactly? My two questions: why can't their body use it, and why is the signaling messed up that they're still hungry?
yeah. So they're not able to use it because of the various things that can block that ability to convert the food that's coming in into energy. So one of the major ones, which we haven't discussed so far, has to do with our gut health. There are these legitimate toxins produced from the gut. I'm not making up, you say toxin and some people are like, are you making something up? I'm talking about very legitimate chemicals. One, for example, is lipopolysaccharide. It's also known as endotoxin. It is the leading driver of sepsis, and you find mild endotoxemia in pretty much any degenerative state, obesity, diabetes, and on and on. Endotoxin is really effective at blocking the function of the electron transport chain, which is where we produce that ATP. So that alone blocks our ability to produce energy. So forget everything else. If you've got these gut issues, you're feeding harmful microbes, you've got this bacterial overgrowth, whether it's SIBO or it's in the large intestine, you're producing all this endotoxin. That means that the food that's coming in can't effectively be used to produce energy. So it has to get stored as fat. There's extra fuel that's not getting used in the tissues. So it gets stored as fat. And then you have the resulting signaling, which you mentioned. Why are the signals getting messed up? In reality, they're not even messed up. It's exactly what they're signaling exactly what our bodies need, which is they still need the energy. They still need that energy, and they need to fix their gut as well. But the hunger signal is still going to be there because there is an inefficiency in converting that food to energy.
That makes sense. Yes. So it's like they're fat, but their body can't access it. So they do need to eat more food.
And they need to fix the problems, right? Fix the gut health and reduce the polyunsaturated fat intake and make sure that we're getting the vitamins and minerals that we need to produce energy, and consider other things that are affecting our hormonal state that are also going to make it really hard to produce energy, looking at thyroid health and on from there.
Yes. Yes. So then, okay, well, we're talking about the gut stuff. So why did these gut problems develop?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and there are a handful of drivers. So part of it would just come down to the types of foods that are coming in. So I know, of course, a lot of people point to the anti-nutrients that exist in a lot of the grains and legumes and nuts and seeds and raw vegetables. Those are pretty effective at wreaking havoc in our intestines. Yes, they prevent the absorption of various nutrients, but they also generally create a pretty inflamed state that allows for harmful bacteria to grow, and they favor a pretty harmful form of microbiome, or presence of certain microbes that are relatively harmful. So that's a major part there. Some of them will also inhibit our digestive enzymes, for example. So then we're not digesting the food that's coming in well, and then it's going down to feed these bacteria and cause overgrowths. So that's like one feature here is we've got these anti-nutrients, certain fibers that are problematic. Again, largely those are in those categories of the grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and raw vegetables. And if we process those really well, if we soak and sprout the nuts and seeds and grains, or we ferment them, it'll reduce a lot of those anti-nutrients and at least reduce their negative effects on the gut. Still not necessarily ideal depending on the circumstance, but that tends to go a long way. Of course, we're not doing that now. We're not eating these foods the way that culture traditionally did. And as far as the raw vegetables, cooking them is normally at least pretty effective at getting rid of most of the anti-nutrients. And so that would be one kind of category of things, something that we're eating that's causing a major issue there. Another that I think is common is more of the result of these metabolic issues. So let's say we're taking in a lot of polyunsaturated fats. They might not directly cause issues in the intestines, although they could. But if those are blocking our energy production, causing issues at the liver and driving oxidative stress, pretty directly, it's going to inhibit bile flow coming out of the liver. That's really important for keeping our small intestine clear. It's actually one of the main antibiotics that our body uses internally to keep away SIBO, to keep a clear small intestine, which is, of course, super important. And that also helps to stimulate our motility. So if we have really slow-moving bowels, that also allows for bacteria to grow higher and higher up. So I had mentioned polyunsaturated fats there. If we are in that low metabolic state, whether it's caused by the polyunsaturated fats or exercising a ton and not sleeping and not getting good meals in and everything, that's also going to turn down all of our digestive function. So you see this very clearly with hypothyroidism, where it drives a decrease in stomach acid, a decrease in motility, the movement of food through the intestines, a decrease in bile flow. And because of that, it's very directly tied with small intestinal bacterial overgrowths. And this doesn't mean that if you're not clinically diagnosed with hypothyroidism, you're fine, because in reality, there's tons of issues with the diagnosis. the reference ranges that we're looking at, and on from there. So a lot of people are dealing with this low metabolism, which is essentially hypothyroidism, that turns down our digestive functions. There's a ton of pieces there. I mean, another thing just as simple as a zinc deficiency is going to, or a sodium deficiency, if we're not getting enough sodium, those are things that are going to affect our stomach acid production. So again, we're not digesting our food. It's not moving through our intestines very well. It's not being absorbed very well. And those are going to lead to all sorts of bacterial or microbial overgrowths that are going to cause issues gut-wise.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of this stuff is because of the modern way we do things, our modern world, and how we're not doing the proper preparation techniques. So we're definitely on the same page on so many things. I've had all kinds of people talk about this stuff, like Dr. Bill Schindler, and on how there's such a big difference between an ancient grain that's not soaked in glyphosate, that's properly fermented and soaked and grown and all this stuff. And you do the bread, the sourdough bread, and a modern white bread or modern any bread. And so huge difference. Yeah, just not eating tons of nuts and seeds and raw vegetables. This stuff. Yeah, I mean these are where the anti-nutrients are, and this is kind of this ancestral thing. Even if we did eat some of those things, it was seasonally, and I think we did figure out a lot of ways to detoxify them. So, and then okay, we should just make sure we're on the same page on all these things and make sure the audience knows. So you're into animal foods, saturated fat is good, organ meats are great. Like just maybe recap this, especially the overlaps in the ancestral health world.
Yeah, so getting a good amount of, let's say, moderate protein intake. So that is maybe a slight difference. We can talk about it as exactly how much protein we want to be getting. But normally I would say up to 20% of our total calories, maybe 25,
But
depending on the
animal protein,
context.
we're not talking about pea protein.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
ruminant animals, whether beef, bison, goat, and lamb. I am a fan of dairy in the right context, so that might be a little bit of a discrepancy. I don't
Oh, I
know
love
your
raw
stance.
dairy. Yeah, I mean, I don't. Well, I don't know if I have a little pen that I'm in. my 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 thing is just ancestral health in general, which I think still fits. Like the only thing that doesn't fit in my ancestral health perspective is the fruit juice, but everything else. But we can still figure that out later. But yes, ancestral health in general. I'm not paleo. I've never been paleo. I've never been keto. I've never been carnivore. I call it sapien.
Mm,
And sapien is, and I think there's two ways to do it. I was actually going to make a graphic where it's a slider. Like you have like this big thing in the middle that we all agree on and we want. And these are our nutrients and proteins and saturated fats and getting rid of the polyunsaturated fats. And this is our core. And then on this side, it's like here's the more pro metabolic way to do it, and then here's the more say like keto way to do it. And like you can just slide back and forth, and maybe based on your preferences, based whatever. I guess you would say let's always go towards the pro metabolic side. But you kind of know what I mean. Is like this there's just the sapien idea isn't into some paleo camp like, oh man, we can't eat dairy because supposedly we didn't drink dairy 30,000 years ago.
right, right. Yeah. I think there's a lot of those things that we're on the same page. Seafood, of course, as well. I would favor really the low PUFA seafood. Saturated fats, some monounsaturated fats, so coconut oil, fats from all the protein sources we mentioned, the non-PUFA ones, olive oil, beef tallow, cocoa butter, things like that. And then, as I mentioned, dairy, maybe some cooked vegetables here and there. And then more of a fan of the carbohydrates, as I mentioned, the fruit-based ones, the roots and tubers, kind of being the centerpieces on that front.
And then we're kind of on the same page, avoiding the same thing,
Mm.
which would be processed grains, fortified grains, processed foods, and all PUFAs, seed oils.
Yeah, and for me, I would especially say nuts and seeds, with especially concerns about the polyunsaturated fats in there. Raw vegetables, yeah.
So yeah, I mean we're right on line. I guess it's just the part about the sugar. It's like I guess maybe you could just tell us just one more time. I know you've kind of told us multiple times, but just why is it better to run on glucose, and why is this supposedly the better way to fuel ourselves? Because in the low carb world, they say it produces more oxidative stress, more reactive oxygen species, ROS, stuff like that. So dive into that a bit more.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of conflation between what's even said, because on one hand you have the people saying low carb ketogenic diets are hormetic, meaning that they're creating stress, small amounts of stress and reactive oxygen species, and that's part of how they get all their benefits. And then they're also making it sound as though carb oxidation creates more reactive oxygen species, which there normally it's not one person saying the same thing, but all of those things are said in the community. So there's some discrepancy there, and I would certainly say that ketogenic diets, fasting, all of that is falls under the hormetic umbrella, which is something I don't think is a good thing. That it drives oxidative stress production, creates stress, and the people in favor of this argue that's a good thing. It makes us stronger, and we become more defensive toward that. We can talk about why I don't think that's the case, but when we drill down onto the cellular level, the mitochondrial level, and we look at just complete glucose oxidation from glucose to ATP versus fat all the way through ATP, so beta oxidation, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, or glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, there's not really much controversy as far as what's actually happening. If you just run each of them through, the glucose leads to a higher ATP to reactive oxygen species ratio. So much less reactive oxygen species gets produced, leads to a much higher NAD to NADH ratio, as opposed to the fat oxidation, which leads to considerable reactive oxygen species production, a much higher FADH2 to NADH ratio, leading to a higher, or I should say lower NAD to NADH ratio. And from the hormetic view, this leads to all sorts of defensive reactions that are supposed to be a good thing. But either way, it's all starting from that point that fat oxidation is better because it creates these ROS, this reverse electron transport. And that's what's going on anytime we're burning fat versus carbohydrate. And I don't think burning fat is inherently bad. I think it's perfect for when we have very low energy demands. So if we're looking at a muscle at rest, it doesn't need to be producing a lot of energy. Fat is great for that. It does produce more reactive oxygen species, and that slows down the rate of respiration, because if we produce too much, it creates a major problem. We have to go into uncoupling, which means zero ATP is being produced. So it's fine for those low energy demands, but what it's not fine for is high energy demands, the areas that are more metabolically active, whether it's our brain or our liver or kidneys. And when you look at the brain, this is why the brain doesn't use fat as a fuel. It can use ketones, but ketones aren't fat. And so we can discuss that, but I'm not saying that this is an issue with ketones, but just it's a good example for why we can't, like the difference between using fat and glucose. Our brains can use that glucose because it keeps the reactive oxygen species low. This is our brain is a place where there's very high demands, and it's very sensitive to oxidative stress, which is why it needs either glucose or ketones. And that's why it can't rely on fat, because the fat produces too much of those ROS, too much of the oxidative stress if you want high levels of ATP. So that's what's going on the cellular level, and then there's all the everything that's happening after that, which is we can debate.
Well, no, I mean, you keep going. I mean, we don't have endless time, but it's just kind of, like I said, hurting people's heads that have heard kind of the opposite message, and that perhaps the carbohydrate or the glucose metabolism is cleaner.
Yeah, and it's tricky when we're trying to really simplify it into like cleaner or dirtier sort of thing. But as I was saying, like I think there's a place for both. I think there's a place for using fat as a fuel at rest. It's much better. It lasts longer, right? So if all of our muscles are using glucose as well, you're going to see that hypoglycemia after an hour or two after eating. If you're just eating high carb, low fat, it's going to create a lot more stress. You have to produce fat, and everything's running on glucose. You run out of it really quick. I think it's great to have both carbs and fat because we can partition it, and our brain can be using that glucose. We can store some and use some at our liver. Our muscles can use some. Our organ systems can use some, but the fat can largely go to fuel the muscles at rest, and that allows us to last for a while between meals. And maybe that's why you feel pretty satiated after the meals that you're talking about that include both. So I think there's a place for both. The real argument I would say from the people who are in the know and looking deep into the physiology from the low carb side is they're saying yes, burning fat for fuel creates more oxidative stress, but that's a good thing because of what's called hormesis, because that leads to the activation of all these pathways that are antioxidant pathways, right? So we've got the NRF2 pathways, we've got the AMPK pathways, and all these things are what activate mitochondrial biogenesis, and they activate autophagy, and they activate uncoupling. And their argument is that this oxidative stress in the right amount is what leads to health. And that is something that I disagree with. And yeah, it's a lot to break down, but I'm happy to dig into that if you want.
Well, yeah, exactly. So that, yeah, why is it not good?
So these are all defensive reactions, and part of the issue with why we even think that they're good in the part of the issue is why we even think they're good in the first place. So it's a lot of reverse engineering, kind of like the cholesterol heart disease hypothesis, where we made some associations and then made some assumptions, and then kind of just now we look at LDL or we just look at cholesterol, and we're kind of ignoring all of the underlying processes. And so I think that's largely what's happened when it comes to autophagy, mitochondrial biogenesis, all of the mediators, the AMP kinase and the NRF2, is we've built some assumptions that these are good, and then now we assume that anything that activates them is good. And the way that we've built these is we've basically said, well, the origins of hormesis, the idea that the stress is good, comes back to some relatively nefarious upbringing in terms of industry, where it's actually been used as a way to defend our exposure to really toxic chemicals in the environment from industry. So this is the presence of lead and cadmium and mercury in our surroundings. And what they said was that these things are actually okay. They're actually beneficial for you in really small amounts. So don't worry about us polluting the environment. It's
Get that
actually not a
hormetic
problem for
stress.
you.
Yeah, I heard that about cigarettes too. It's like, oh yeah, you're
Yeah.
getting that hormetic stress from cigarettes. But I mean, you're getting everything else along with it, though.
Right. And I would say you don't want the hormetic stress anyway. And
Well,
they
well, then, okay. You have to say then. So we need some. Can you have both worlds? Like you need some hormetic stress, or you still work out and you still do certain things, right? So how do people find that balance of like you're saying we don't need it at all? What are you actually saying?
so my issue with the idea to drill in real specifically, the idea with hormesis is that the stress is what leads to the benefits. And that's the concept I have issue with. So I think exercise is great in the right amount, but it's not great because it causes stress. It's great because of other reasons. It increases our circulation. We put tension on the muscles that causes a bunch of very specific adaptations. We increase lymphatic flow. There's a ton of things that are going on there that are not just causing systemic stress. And I would say those are responsible for the benefits, not the stress. And it might sound like I'm nitpicking or being semantic, but it actually matters a lot, because then what happens is we have a situation where we're taking resveratrol, or we're doing fasting or doing all sorts of, cold thermogenesis, whatever it is, because it activates the same pathways. But if those pathways were never beneficial in the first place and it was something else, it makes a difference. It actually means that those things might not be beneficial because they activate the same stress. So stress is inevitable. There is always going to be some amount of stress. But I would argue that we want to do things that are beneficial with minimal or smaller amounts of stress, despite stress, rather than because of stress. We don't want to be encouraging the stress. And so, what I would say, just kind of a broad overview, is when it comes to like fasting, there are incredible benefits there. I would say they come back to gut health related benefits, avoiding some really terrible foods that might be coming in, giving our gut a break when it's permeable and it's got microbial imbalances and all sorts of things, maybe giving ourselves a break from poor glucose oxidation. But what I would say is not responsible for the benefits is the stress that's created. And so that's kind of my gripe with hormesis. And yeah, there's details to kind of work through there. But the point is that the stress isn't beneficial. It doesn't mean we should avoid it entirely. And we just want to find, I guess, as you said, a balance. But I would say the balance is kind of a balance between the specific benefits of an intervention and the stress it causes. So if we can get those same benefits that people get from fasting without the stress, I'd way prefer that. And I would say that you can. There's a lot of things you can do to help your gut health without just avoiding eating food entirely. And I'd way prefer to do that without the stress versus trying to get the stress from fasting.
Well, might as well say what that is. Is that just eating really clean foods and not eating all those bad things that we've already listed?
Definitely. Yeah. And if somebody has SIBO, treat the SIBO, right? Don't just not eat and not feed it. It's kind of like that same Band-Aid. If someone's having issue digesting their food and you need to consider things that could support stomach acid production or bile production or digestive enzyme production, let's do those things. So much of it can be resolved by eating the right foods, but sometimes we want some extra support there, and that's fine too. I think we should do that as opposed to just putting the Band-Aid on that also causes the stress.
Well, I want to be anti-fragile. I've never been a fan of all these extreme methods of, yeah, fasting for long periods. I've never fasted for more than 23 hours in my life, actually. Uh, and yeah, so I'm not into all this extreme stuff, but I also don't want to live in a little cloud fairy bubble land with a bunch of pillows around me. So it's like, what is that balance? Like, it seems like we've always had some sort of stressors in our life. I think maybe I'll answer for you is that we have enough stressors in our modern world. You have jobs and environmental toxins and all kinds of craziness that maybe we don't need anymore. But yeah, what is that balance? Like, yeah, and what stressors are okay? And like, just tell me like the lifestyle portion. Like, what would you do? I recommend.
Yeah, it's a great point and great question. And, if we think about it, we're not indiscriminately choosing things that cause stress. We might say to fast, but we're not saying, hey, you should just sleep half of the amount you would normally sleep. Just sleep 4 hours tonight to get your stress, right? So we do it because we are aware that there's benefits in terms of the specific thing. So I think, yes, there's more than enough stress to go around between how much we're working and the psychological stress, what's going on in the world. So try to minimize those sorts of things, right? Let's not reduce our sleep or anything like that. Let's get a lot of sleep and let's relax, but let's get sunlight. Let's work out, and exercise and move in a way that you enjoy. And whether that's more intense or less intense, I don't think matters so much as long as it's something that you're doing consistently and you're not sedentary. Like, I think those things are great places to kind of put our effort and where it's very much worth the stress because of all these other benefits that we get. So yeah, I'm not saying let's live in a bubble and if you lay in bed, that's the way to health. Of course, stress is a part of life, but we do want to choose what we're doing. And so I think movement is a great place for that. Having cognitively stimulating conversations and digging into research, for me is something that I enjoy as well. Sometimes it can be a little stressful. So,
Okay, well, we have to talk about cold then, because you brought up cold stuff. Again, I love a cold plunge, but I mean, I do it like once a month. I don't know. It's not like I'm always doing it. Is there a limit, or like, why not? Like, why would it not be great? Like once a week for a few minutes. I just don't like to push it. Maybe it's just because I'm a baby and I can't sit in that thing.
so if it's something you enjoy and you want to do it, whether it's some long distance running or it's doing a cold plunge or it's getting in a sauna or I don't know, it's something else that's like psychologically difficult. If you want to do a fast because you like to prove to yourself that you can do it, that's fine. I would say let's not do those things just because they're stressful. So I don't think that there is much in the way of benefit, or at least I think there's much better ways to get benefits from those things. So if you like the cold plunge because you want to teach yourself to be resilient, that's fine. That's a separate goal from it just being this is the healthiest thing I can do. And I would say that the stress from that is not providing such a benefit. Uh, if yeah, does that answer the question?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I feel amazing when I get out of that cold plunge. But again, I'm
Yeah.
not like some sort of cold plunge expert or enthusiast.
Right.
I've done it a
And
few times.
drinking a lot of coffee can, feel really good as well. And sometimes that can be the result of dipping into stress hormones, especially if you're doing it without having a good meal. And if someone I think there's better ways to feel good, I guess is the other thing I would say. And so I'd prefer to do the things that allow you to feel good that also are more beneficial and less stressful.
Interesting. I mean, well, what about all this sauna stuff? So to go the opposite way, I've done a lot more sauna in my life, and again, I feel amazing. And there's all these studies, especially out of Finland and those Nordic countries, and longevity, this and that. Are you saying maybe that's something else?
I prefer sauna, not personally, but just from a health standpoint, I prefer sauna to the cold because I think a warmer body temperature, as we were talking about, generally goes along with higher metabolism and tends to be better. So, and it tends to be less stressful. So I'd much prefer sauna for that reason. I think there's considerable benefits. I think if you do it long enough, it'll start to dip into the stress maybe too much. But I think there's a lot of, as I was saying earlier, you get good lymphatic flow and blood flow and you sweat and there's detoxification that goes on. I think there's a lot of great things from saunas. I'd much prefer or generally lean more toward a sauna as opposed to a good cold plunging.
All right, I love it. Okay, back to um, I only eat 2 meals a day. It works for me. I'm not opposed to changing my ways and experimenting, but from your perspective, if I'm getting 2,600 to 3,000 calories in 2 meals, I'm not hungry in the morning. I'm eating whole food sources of carbs. I'm eating maybe honey with yogurt and fruit for dessert, even like, getting a whole host of nutrients. You know what I mean? Definitely, I've done the math. retrospectively, because people ask, oh, how many calories, what are the nutrients? I'm like, okay, I'll calculate it once, but that's it. No, but I mean, I'm getting amazing amount of nutrients. Like I'm eating oysters, I'm eating some organ meats, I'm eating a whole host of foods that cover all the nutrient bases. Is there any reason why I'm causing my body stress? Or, I mean, I'm just not hungry. I don't know. Like, why do I need to eat breakfast?
So sometimes, and I'm not saying this is necessarily happening in your situation, but you mentioned that you're not really hungry. So I did want to mention sometimes when I'm working with people who have come from fasting or low carb, they're not used to it. They're not used to eating as early. And B, they do tend to have those elevated stress hormones. And then, so I know you've got the CGM. I don't know what your fasting glucose is like, but it's something I might consider is what is it looking like in the morning up until you eat? Are there any elevations there? Because that could actually signify that there might be some stress hormones going on that might be keeping your appetite suppressed. So it's something I would consider. But big picture wise, that aside, I would say, we talked about the potential issues on the blood sugar side and as I was kind of saying, we're depleting that glucose overnight. And so normally the thing that's naturally supposed to wake us up is a spike in cortisol. So throughout the night, our stress hormones are pretty low. And as it gets into late morning, the cortisol starts to rise. And that's because we're running out of liver glycogen. And that's naturally going to wake us up. It's kind of that natural rhythm. And normally it'll cause like a morning hyperglycemia for a moment. And that's, normally pretty commonly seen. And I would say that the best way to then get that cortisol down and get those stress hormones down is to take in some carbohydrate and break the fast overnight, which would be with breakfast. And could somebody just kind of keep going from then until lunch, and do a fast? Absolutely. But I think A, we're relying on the stress hormones, and B, we're missing out on an opportunity to eat more. So you mentioned, you're in the 26 to 100 to 3,000 calorie range. Maybe that's perfect for you. It's hard, I don't know all the details here, but I know you.
I'm not very heavy. I'm only like 150 something pounds.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, so maybe that is the
I think
upper
that's a
limit.
lot for my
Yeah.
body weight.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I know when you were talking with Brad Marshall, and he's pointing out some great things here. That average calorie intake was 3, maybe even 4 or more thousand calories not so long ago. And so I think if there's something that allows us to produce more energy, it means that it's something that allows for better repair, regeneration, better growth of all of our tissues. And so if this was something that allowed you to eat more and of course maintain your leanness, which would mean that you're actually using that fuel well, I think that would probably be something that would lead to some benefit health wise. But of course, there's individuality, and maybe there's some unique circumstances, or you're just a part of a group of people who's totally fine without that. It's hard to say, but that would be some of the thought processes that I would be thinking. Like that's kind of the line of thinking I'd be going down.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm like being able to eat more. Now I'm into that. I want to get my body temperature up to 98.6. So I was saying I did have a bit of these small problems because I didn't ever go hardcore keto or anything. But being a bit low carb, I think I'd wake up in the middle of the night. I think I did have that cortisol in the middle of the night thing, ran out of glycogen type of thing, a little bit cold, low body for sure, low body temp. So I do want to eat more. And it is interesting that for longevity wise, it sounds like you want to lower metabolism for longevity, but that's not exactly true, right? It's like you don't want to just it is a bit counterintuitive, but you do want to be able to eat more and kind of have a higher metabolism.
Yeah, so the idea that the faster our metabolic rate is, the faster we age, is really actually an outdated view. It's one that a lot of people still hold, but in the research, it's pretty outdated, and it comes from the kind of industrial revolution line of thinking, where we're machines, and the faster you use a machine, the faster it wears out, and the more it deteriorates. And when you look at the relationship with like between species, so you look at mice and you look at humans and you look at apes and you look at lizards and you look at elephants, you see this relationship. The higher metabolism or the lower metabolism per body weight lives longer, right? So we're a bigger body weight, elephants are much larger. We have a lower metabolic rate per body weight and we live longer. And so that's where some of these associative ideas came in. But then there are some confounding variables there. And to skip through some of the details, what they actually find is that when you're looking within a species, so just at the humans or just the dogs or whatever it is, the individuals with higher metabolic rates actually age slower and live longer. And there are some reasons why this is. It actually has a lot to do with the polyunsaturated fats. So one of the most one of the things most tightly tied with aging is the amount of polyunsaturated fats in the structure of the cells. So like in the
Mm.
phospholipid membrane is what they describe it as. And when you have more of those polyunsaturated fats, you're much less efficient with the energy you produce or the food that's coming in. And so you actually end up aging faster. And so what they find is that these organisms that are much smaller, let's say like rodents, their metabolic rate is higher, but it's actually because they're less efficient with the energy they're producing because they have much higher amounts of these PUFA. And when you account for the PUFA composition, it's actually, and when you account for that, it's actually the higher metabolic rate wins out. So, and this is something that's kind of being born on of newer research and looking at oxidative stress being involved, and that's a huge problem with the PUFA because they're very susceptible to it. But yeah, some really interesting research there, and actually suggesting that higher metabolic rate does translate to better function and longevity.
I love it. Yeah, I don't want to be those. I've seen those. What is it? The society of the people who the calorie restriction society, and they look like they're about to die. They're like a bag of bones, and they think they're going to live forever. I think that's totally bogus. Okay, I'm glad you brought it around to PUFA and all this stuff because that was going to be my last topic here. I am, absolutely against the seed oils and all this stuff, and I've been doing content on this for years and years and years. I'm glad I ran across. Well, I mean, Mark Sisson, my first influence from 8 or 9 years ago was talking about avoiding these seed oils. But I was going to mention Tucker Goodrich that I did a podcast with 5 years ago and really, shook up my world to really focus on it. And then now a lot of people are really focused on this, right? This is this big new thing, PUFA, PUFA, PUFA. I love it. I love it. I love it. But with this pro-metabolic approach, it's kind of blaming it all on PUFA. And I just want to make sure that can we? I mean, I know it's not all, but yes, there's like the gut problems and these anti-nutrients and refined grains, and those are problems. But if you're saying all sugar, like you're putting 14 teaspoons of sugar, not that you're always going to do that, but you did it. That if sugar is completely off the hook, then I just want to hear your kind of thesis statement one more time, or maybe just hit it in a different way, that it really is all these PUFAs because they're in all the processed foods, or maybe say not all PUFA, but are we really attributing all of the disease in the world to them? And I think I'm okay with it. I just want to make sure because it seems so simple and so elegant. Usually it's not so simple and elegant where it's just like, all we have to do is, avoid these PUFAs and we're fine.
So I don't normally attribute all of it to that. And maybe that's because working with people, especially ones who have restricted PUFA for a very long time, some of them are still dealing with issues. And I find that we have to dig into other, work on other aspects of health that still fall into the bioenergetic lens. And maybe this is just long-term damage from PUFA that hasn't been undone. But in general, at least personally, it's not my view that it's all PUFA. But I think it's a huge variable. So my view of it comes back again to the bioenergetic lens, meaning that it's an issue metabolically, an issue with converting food to energy properly and efficiently. And PUFA is a huge, huge problem there. Like by far the biggest one, the one that's been introduced into huge amounts in our society. It's very easy to point to it as one of the biggest differences between, the processed food, just modern cultures versus traditional ones. So I think it's a massive one. I don't think it's the only one. As we talked about gut health, PUFA does of course have a role there. We talked about nutrient availability. I think sunlight is a huge thing. I think stress matters a lot. I think movement matters a lot. I think social interaction matters a lot. I think there's a lot of pieces here, but PUFA is definitely a big one.
Well, it does kind of make sense, and of course, yes, all those other factors matter. But it's like Kate Shanahan does these great graphs, of like what went up, and she's like, it's not the carbs. Like the carbs actually went down a little. People have been eating less sugar, yet the PUFA's been on the rise. So, kind of makes sense, especially when you get down to the mitochondrial level and the problems it causes with energy production and just the membrane of your cells. So, any last things about that?
Yeah, I definitely don't want to downplay it, right? I mean, what I was mentioning, and there's some great papers by it's AJ Holbert who has pointed this out and talked about the incorporation of PUFA into the membrane being the driver of aging, like the one thing that is most related to aging outside of anything else. So yeah, and this is across species, right? Not just looking at us, but looking at all species. So without a doubt, I think it's an absolutely massive problem and massive driver of poor health. And yeah, a super important one. I think there's other things to of course consider as well, which I know you're not saying is not the case, but yeah,
Yeah.
I just don't want to say, at least personally, I wouldn't say like it is the only thing, but yeah.
Uh-huh. No, it's just interesting because it's just that's one of my only other critiques over the years when I started learning about the pro metabolic approach. It's like, so it's all PUFAs because then, you point to this other research, like all the trolls online like to point to other research that, oh, when people use PUFAs, it's not that bad. You know what I mean? Like, what is your response to that? If these big meta analysis of like, big studies.
So the research looking at PUFA can be tricky, and part of that is because you don't really see any change in you don't see much of a change in terms of what's going on internally until you get PUFA considerably lower than what's normally looked at. We're talking single digit percentages. So if you're looking at 10% PUFA intake versus 20% versus 30%, you'll still see differences oftentimes, but it's not going to be anywhere near as dramatic as when you're really getting much lower. So unfortunately, what it does mean is that just getting the fried food and just a little bit every day, even eating at Chipotle, which fries everything in rice bran oil and all that, can be enough to really still cause a problem. It does really need to be considerably lower than the average person is eating to make a difference. But I think that's at least one major problem with using that research.
Do you have any others? Because it is actually a big thing to figure out, right? It's like, I know that there's all these problems with the research and who's funding it and just what's the limitations of what we can do studies on and all blah blah blah. But yeah, is there anything else? Because I think that's a huge one. Is that, yeah, there is no big population we've ever studied that eats like you and I.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, yeah, 100%. And it's tough. Each study is kind of designed differently, and so I think a lot of them can be picked apart. And as you're saying, there's a lot of issues with research as a whole, and we don't want to ever kind of solely rely on it either. And whether it's someone who's funding it a certain way, interpreting it a certain way, only including the result from the trial that actually went the way they wanted, there's a lot of those things going on too. And I do think it's worth mentioning how massive of an industry that is, and when there is such consensus in the literature and so much like money and desire and power behind it, it is pretty tough to publish information against it and to have it go through the peer review process and still have a job after. So there's a lot of reason I think that somebody might not be so motivated to do that.
Oh, I'm right there with you. Yeah, maybe in the next couple decades, it's like the whole science progresses one funeral at a time. I don't know if we'll ever get there though, because of the giant industries still pushing all these oils. But I am right there with you. The last thing to wrap it up though, I just want to get that ancestral lens one more time, just to get your take on, is this pro metabolic fit with the ancestral lens? Because I don't know. I don't see us being guzzling orange juice every 3 hours. You know what I mean?
So I don't think you have to guzzle orange juice to be looking at things in terms of the bioenergetic lens or to be applying those principles. So I definitely think there are principles that can be applied regardless of whether or not you want to have juice. And I don't at all think juice is required. Uh, I think that doesn't mean it's a bad thing either. And maybe we can talk through the details. I mean, maybe it's also worth mentioning what you view as the ancestral view. Like what does that actually mean and encompass in kind of a big picture sense?
Well, really, yeah. I mean, I'm looking at the time scales of human evolution of 3.5 million years ago. Cracking open bone marrow to 2 million years ago to, then the most recent would really just be say 30,000 years ago, when like the sort of the end of the paleo era, or 14,000 years ago agriculture. But like the most of human evolution didn't have agriculture. And but yeah, you have to get into where we were living. Is it by the equator? Is it up north? How much time were we there? What was available? And just maybe that.
Yeah, and I think there's so much value in looking back at what traditional cultures were eating, what the research looking at us historically tells us that we were eating, and what we're biologically adapted to. But I think another maybe discrepancy here as well is I would say that just because we were doing something or we weren't doing something doesn't mean that the thing we were doing was ideal or that the things that we weren't doing were not ideal. And so I think we might be able to allow for even better function with various things that we have in our modern day, right? I mean, we have certain aspects of agriculture that could be great, whether it's having a real consistent source of dairy, grass-fed dairy or meat or fruit, that we can now do certain things to get that in places that it wasn't available before. And if we're trying to raise our metabolism and the goal is to get back to that point where we're using way more fuel and producing way more energy, I think a lot of modern creation maybe allows for that and maybe allows us to surpass for some beyond somewhere where we were before. And so if fiber in the fruit was a limiting factor for some reason and juice doesn't have that fiber and we're able to get twice as much carbohydrate in from that juice and produce so much more energy, I think there's the potential that that leads to adaptations that mean, we have improved brain function or improved liver capacity, which allows us to detoxify various toxins better. For example, fructose increases the detoxification rate of alcohol. So I think there is a discrepancy in terms of the lens, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but at least from my view and from the bioenergetic view, there's this lens that we can do things that will allow us to continue to improve in terms of our energetic capacity. And those aren't necessarily going to be the things that we were doing historically. And just because we adapted to something historically doesn't mean it didn't come at a cost to our structure and function. So if we had to go through famines a lot, that might have been something that constantly dampened our metabolism and we can never keep it high enough because we always had to deal with that. And so if we can avoid that now, I think that can lead to greater function. And so there's maybe a discrepancy there as well.
Mm. I don't know. This is such a hard thing to think about. I'm not saying that we didn't have access to carbohydrates. I mean, I was with the Hadza, they were digging up tubers, but there actually
Mhm.
wasn't much carb in them. They were just a bunch of fiber that they spit out. But still, I mean, they could find some honey. I mean, I see both sides of this. Like, I think we did have access to whole, natural source of carbs for much of half the year. I don't know. And it depends on where we were. But the opposite side to that is what you're saying. Usually a species, it evolves, and yeah, how they evolved is basically how they thrive. It's not like, do you think we could give a lion a better diet and it would do better? You know what I mean? It's like we got this way because of our diet and our environment, and it took millions of years to get here. And this is like, I don't think there's a better diet for a zebra or a better diet for a lion eating that zebra. That's what it is. It just seems like maybe no, but I kind of understand your point. Maybe, but it's just like how. But I don't know. It's like, how would we have gotten this far? Like, this is where we are. This is why we exist based on how we're living. And I don't know if we had famines. I'm talking to Dr. Bill Schindler, who studies this stuff. He's like, hey, we were thriving. Like, the story of the human race is not about survival. It was thriving. It's like, you're not going to have a bunch of kids and like multiply if you're like about to die every 2 seconds.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. No, I agree. I don't think it's a story of just barely surviving and making it to the next generation. And I did want to mention also, just, I know you were pointing to the Hadza, and there are, of course, tribal cultures that thrive on, or not only thrive, but have access to carbohydrates year round. And it's over, 60-70% of their diet is coming from carbohydrates. So it's worth pointing out too. But yeah, so this comes down to like what this current discussion now is, we're getting into a view of evolution, right? And so what is driving evolution? Is it random mutation, or is there a two-way street with our environment where it affects us, let's say, epigenetically, and that then can affect our genes? And if that's the case, assuming that's the case, then what's available in our environment is going to directly affect how we evolve from here, and has affected our species and all the other species prior to us too. And so you see this looking at apes, for example, where the ones that tend to rely more on fruit intake have larger brains. Like, you see a pretty strong association between those things. And so who knows, maybe you give them fruit juice instead and they have even more, and then their brains get even bigger. And I'm kind of saying that a little bit facetiously, but I do think it's important to remember that at least modern research is suggesting that there is a two-way street there. And so perhaps we could create an even better environment. And we already are, right? We're already evolving one way or another, whether it's good or bad. I mean, if we can fill, they talk about brain size decreasing or head size decreasing since bringing in modern agriculture with grains. So who's to say that it can't go the other way and even beyond the other way based on the modern environment? I think we're in a constant flux there. We have to be going one way or the other, or there's always movement. And so I think that we should consider the possibility that we can create an environment that leads to really great pushes forward. Of course, not in necessarily one generation, but over time.
I like it. No, I appreciate that. That's a good point. Let's wrap it up here. This has been amazing discussion. I hope people I enjoyed this and they're not. Uh, I think my audience isn't stuck in a camp. Sometimes I see these comments where it seems like they're stuck in a camp, but I think generally people are open to this information. And I've been doing a lot of it over the past really over 2 years. I've been like, kind of in and out and up and down and just doing all my experimentation. But I think it's great. I think it's great. And maybe I'll just start guzzling orange juice every 2 seconds. I'm just kidding. I will though. I will try some of the stuff. And by stuff I mean orange juice. I'm on the raw milk train. I think it's pretty great, and
I love it. Yeah.
good source of carb. It does have carbs. It is, yeah. Thank you, man. So yeah, where can people find you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I know I did bring up, we were talking about some potentially inflammatory topics here with fructose and hormesis and things like that. And so these are topics that I have a lot of free information on my website in terms of articles, and also are topics that I explore on my podcast, which is called the Energy Balance Podcast. And for someone who's maybe looking for some more clear takeaways in terms of macronutrient intake and movement and stress, I have a free mini course geared toward energy balance that they can sign up for to get all that information. It's a free 7-day mini course, and that can be found at jayfeldmanwellness.com/energy, which is also, that's my website, jayfeldmanwellness.com.
I love it. We'll link to those, and you're on Instagram as well.
Yep, my handle is JF Wellness.
Awesome. I'll link to that as well. Thanks so much for coming on, man. Maybe we'll talk again.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Brian.